Good day. I'm Colonel James Innes, and I can't tell you how fine it is to be back here at William and Mary College, to be here amongst all you fine young scholars and you learned professors. I was once a boy in these halls myself many years ago, and since then I have done a great many things. I have been the colonel of the 15th Regiment, commissioner of the Virginia Navy, the second secretary of the great Commonwealth of Virginia, and now I am a commissioner serving up in Philadelphia regarding a particular circumstance of the Jay Treaty, one of the provisions. I will not bore you with the details. Needless to say, I've traveled a long way to be here. But now that I'm here, I'm much satisfied to be partaking in a great reunion of the Society of the Cincinnatus, as is my dear old companions at arms, Mr. James Monroe, as well as all those other good Williamsburg men what did serve on the Continental line. It's the first time in near 15 years that I've worn this uniform, and I dare say it has shrunk somewhat, being up in the attic so long as it was. At least I pray that's why it's so tight, rather than the most appealing nature of my wife's cooking. Well, in any case, I wish to thank you all for your hospitality, and I must say I've heard many wonderful things since I've been here, but I've also heard some things that I find to be a mite unsettling. Many of you young scholars have voiced to me a great affection for the French Republic and its struggle. Many more of you have told me that you believe it imperative for the United States of America to reach our arms across the ocean to our revolutionary brothers and take up their cause against our old enemy, Britain. Now, I dare say many of you are very young, so I will forgive you for your foolishness. But that is the most idiotic idea I ever heard since old Captain Doohickey tried to make a cannon out of wood. God rest his soul. In any case, I am not a hater of France. I am not prejudiced toward the French people. In fact, if loving French people was against the law, I should be hanged for it. I fought alongside with them at Yorktown. They are a fine and gallant race. However, their interests and their quarrels with England and Austria and near everybody in the world has absolutely nothing to do with us. And I would entreat you men, you lads who are too young to remember the Revolution, do not be so hasty to abandon peace. There's so much what you all take for granted. Simply sitting in a tavern with your friends, having a pipe, having a cup, and not fearing that your plate will be empty or that someone's going to come marching down that street and harm you is such a gift, such a blessing. Hold on to it as long as you can, and make war only when the honor of our nation and the interests of our nation dictate it be so. Well, I'd make my sermon shorter, but like the preacher said, once I get started, I'm too lazy to stop. So I shall now cease with my pontification and invite you lads and you learned professors to ask me anything you like.
Thank you so much. Should it be Colonel Innes?
Yes, many still call me Mr. Attorney. But I tell you, I enjoyed that position very much, but I never cared for that title. I do prefer Colonel.
Wonderful. I will keep that in mind. Colonel Innes, since you have your uniform on it, I think it begs the question, when did you first join with the Continental Army, and what compelled you to enlist?
Well, I joined before there was a Continental Army. It was 1775. It was the spring. And you see, Lord Dunmore, the tyrant, had dissolved our legislature, and as a result, we had no militia. Without a militia, we were defenseless out west against the uprisings of the Indians, or back here against an uprising of slaves. So at first, we formed these companies to defend our towns, our homes, right? And then, eventually, we had to form them to make war on our own government. Those were most difficult times. But I suppose I joined because of what we all read in the paper every day back then. In those days, There wasn't one single week that passed with a single bit of good news. But the most horrifying news we read was of what was happening up in Massachusetts. There, very early in the 70s, they placed that country under martial law, and its streets of Boston and its other towns were filled with redcoat soldiers. Now, to wear this uniform, or the uniform of any soldier, I believe is a very sacred thing, a very sacred trust. We are charged not only with making war, but with protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Now, them redcoat soldiers up in Massachusetts, they had the same sacred obligation to protect the innocents. But instead, they turned their muskets upon those they had been charged to look after and slaughtered them in cold blood at the bloody massacre and at the peaceful commons of Lexington and Concord. In addition, the crown took from them the most sacred thing what a free man can have, an elected legislature by which to exercise his will and to remedy his grievances. Now, many in those days said, what business if this is ours? Massachusetts is another country. The Yankee is an alien. Why bother about this? And the reason was very simple. What they could do to one colony, they could do with another. We saw this truth, and we organized for it, and when the war came, we were ready. My company, my volunteer company, the Williamsburg Volunteers, was integrated into the Continental Army, and we played a major role in the liberation of Hamptontown early in the conflict. In fact, we fired the first shots in Virginia in the war, I'm pleased to say.
Wonderful. Well, while we're speaking about the Revolution and remembering back to those times, Diana was wondering what was family life back then. I'm assuming she meant during the war because she said that she even had family that served during the Revolutionary War with General Washington. So can you tell us a little bit about, did you have a family life during the war?
Well, I had a family life. I was a married man through half the war, so I was. It was very difficult. I was, at the time, very much fond of a young lady by the name of Eliza Cox. She was the mayor's daughter, Mayor Cox. He was the very best mayor what we ever had. But in any case, she and I had a great passion for one another, and for 3 years I was separated from her. And every day I was gone from her was an agony. Felt like 1,000 years. Finally, after I was wounded at the Battle of Germantown, I was persuaded to resign my commission and marry her. And then we did settle down to family life. I received a dowry from her father of a fine manor house on Francis Street, as well as 2 slaves and a good parcel of land which we rented out. And there we began our business. Now, my life was much easier than many of the men. Many of them often deserted, not out of cowardice, but out of a desire to take care of their wives to bring in the crops. In fact, we always used to fear desertion at planting time. Fortunately, a goodly number of their men brought the wives and children with them. Yes, indeed. And they proved themselves to be very useful, looking after the laundry and the sick. Although they could present difficulty at times. I remember, I believe it was 78, we could not break down camp and withdraw. We had to hold our withdrawal for 2 days because we had 2 young women who were preparing to give birth. And we couldn't move till them babies was born. And so I dare say those were Spartan offspring born literally right in the field. Family life, long answer made short, it was difficult, but well worth it.
We have one more question about the war specifically before we go on to other topics. Serena was wondering, what was the worst hardship you faced during your time fighting in the Revolution?
Desertion and a lack of spirit. Also supplies. Logistics was exceedingly difficult. We were attempting to feed an army with supply lines that stretched more than 1,000 miles in any direction. Now that was hard enough in the summertime, but in the winter it became all but impossible. You see, to feed an army, one requires cattle, great herds of cattle, and other beasts what are required to pull the wagons and such, yes? Now these animals have to be fed. Now in the spring and summer and autumn you have grass upon the ground, fodder. I don't know if any of y'all ever been to Pennsylvania, but in that country it grows so cold in the winter that the grass itself rots and dies, and there's nothing for the animals to eat, which means then you must bring hundreds of thousands of pounds worth of hay and millet and other sundry things to feed these beasts, else they starve and die. And then, of course, you can eat them, but you can only eat them once, and then you don't have an oxen to pull your cart, you don't have a horse to ride. And indeed, there were circumstances where we were compelled to eat our horses, our oxen. Some of the men even ate cats back in 78 during the winter. There were times when I thought this whole business would fail, I must confess. But I'm very pleased that I was wrong.
I think we're all very pleased that we were wrong in any of those doubts. There have been a few questions about you and your family, so I have a few here that I'm going to get to. But the first one, let's look back. Ian wants you to tell us about your father, and he was asking how the name changed, the spelling of Innes changed.
The spelling of Innes. Well, I'm pleased to tell you the spelling of Innes has not changed. My name is spelled I-N-N-E-S now, just as it was spelled in the time of William the Conqueror. It is exactly the same. I know that because my father was the first of my family on the male side, in any case, to live on this continent. My father came from Aberdeen. He was only supposed to stay in America for 6 months, here on a mission for the Church of England, you see. He was a reverend, my father was. And while he was here, he met a young lady by the name of Catherine, and he became so smitten with her that he obsessed upon her memory on the long voyage back to Scotland, and all the long and lonely months he mourned and pined for her, until finally he could bear it no more, and through some circumstance which was never quite explained to me, he managed to persuade the Bishop of London to send him back over here permanently, where he did marry my mother. And I'm very pleased he did, or I wouldn't be talking to you just now.
That's wonderful. You seem to anticipate Elizabeth's question. She was wondering where your parents were from. So you said your father from Aberdeen?
Aye, from Aberdeen, from Scotland.
And your mother from Virginia?
King and Queen's County.
Wonderful.
6 generations, yes indeed.
Wonderful. Well, also thinking back, Aaron was wondering if you had any memories from your childhood that you're particularly fond of or want to share with the group.
Well, yes, I do. It has to do with a foxhound. That's one of my earliest memories of childhood, was a lazy foxhound by the name of Brutus. And he would never get up. He would never hunt those foxes. He just wanted to lay underneath that old oak tree and scratch and bite at his leg. So I determined that I would get him up. And one day they were having the hunt and they were blowing the horns and all that. So I took a fine piece of birch and I went up to him and I say, "Brutus, get you up now and you fetch them foxes, yea?" Or some such. And, well, Brutus would not move, so I give him a whipping with that birch. And he moved. Lord, he moved. He chased me, it seemed like 100 miles. Run me straight up a tree, so he did. And I didn't come down for more than an hour. So I did succeed in animating the beast, but not in the way I hoped.
Wonderful. And now Sharon was asking not about looking back in family, but your current position. You mentioned that you married earlier, during the war, in fact. And Sharon was wondering, do you have any children?
Well, yes, I've had 2 children in my life. One living, and one who has paid his debt to nature. My son's name was Robert, and Robert was a scholar of William and Mary, or at least he was going to be, but when the yellow fever came, it took him away. My daughter Ann is still living, and I'm pleased that she is currently betrothed to the grandnephew, that is, of President Peyton Randolph himself. I tell you, a Virginia man like me, born in an obscure county, from a family what no one ain't never heard of, to marry your daughter to a Randolph, well, it do not become any finer than that.
And that actually leads to another wonderful question. We mentioned this gentleman earlier, talk about one of the great known Virginians. Elizabeth was wondering what your opinion, how did you feel about General Washington?
Oh, Lord. How does one feel about the son? I dare say Virginia has never known a finer man than President Washington. This was a gentleman who was born low in his family, not the first son. He had to fight for everything he had. And in all of his endeavors, whether it was serving the crown out in the bloody frontier near Fort Duquesne, or serving in the Congress, or finally taking up arms against the tyrant king, whatever he done, he always personified the most ideal aspects of Republican virtue. He always put himself behind the cause. His country first, aye? Yes, indeed, just like Cincinnatus or Cato, but these are men that you read of in books, what have been dead for thousands of years. General Washington is alive, and in him lives the very best of America, the best of what we are, what we had been before, and what we may well become in the future. In other words, I like him.
I thank you so much, Colonel Innes. I can see now why you were chosen to be Mr. Attorney General. You have a way with words. Looking back to the war, William was wondering who made up the militia troops that you led during the war. So I suppose that meant both at the beginning, when you were an independent company, and then as well when you were a member of the Army proper.
Ah, yes. Well, it was quite a variety. There were 3 independent companies here in Williamsburg in the early days because, we simply could not agree upon who should be in charge, Captain Nicholas, Captain Finney, and myself, so we simply made 3 companies. Thought we should be thrice as safe in that circumstance. Now, later on, it was made up mostly of poor farmers, poor, simple white farmers. That was the same with the 15th Virginia once we were integrated into the Continental Army. Now later, when I served in the militia, we took in, anyone who would fight, who could fight, and during the worst times of it, we even took in Negroes, we took in black soldiers, as did other Virginia regiments. And it's speculated today by some natural philosophers that the Negro is naturally inferior to the white man. Now, I do not know if that is true or if that is not. I'm of a divided mind on it. But I can tell you, them soldiers, them black soldiers, what we had, wasn't inferior to nobody. And I pray that all of them get the freedom they were promised for their service. Sadly, it's been 15 years since the peace, and many of them still have not.
Very good. And we had Scott, who was asking also about the war. In your opinion, what was the major turning point of the war? You mentioned earlier there was that fear that maybe we would not come out victorious. Was it the crossing of the Delaware? Was it Valley Forge? What do you think was the turning point for the American cause?
Well, the war was so recent that an objective history cannot yet be written upon it, so I can only speak from my own experience. I should have to say the Battle of Trenton. Now that was a very small, limited engagement, but it occurred at a pivotal time. I joined the Continental Army. That's when we first brought the 15th up there. And I remember the wretched state of the camp, the tents falling apart, men sickly, starving, filthy, the smell of it, the smell of the latrines and foul tents and clothing. It was a horrible circumstance, horrible. And yet General Washington determined that he would take that army and launch a surprise attack against the Hessians on the other side of the river. And I can tell you, if we had failed in that endeavor, His Excellency General Washington would now either be dead or in exile, and the rest of us would be slaves under the yoke of Great Britain. But we did not fail. We crossed, we surprised them just as we hoped, and we killed more than 50 of them and took 500 prisoners. And when people read about that in the papers here in Williamsburg and in New York and Philadelphia, that gave hope back to them. It's a sorry thing when hope leaves you, eh? It's like a rope of smoke. But once you get a hold of it, then you can't never let go. And we were able to give the people back that hope and to renew the cause. And so I should say, though historians may disagree, that was the turning point. That was the moment when we could not fail, and we did not fail the American people.
Thank you so much, and thank you for your service. One final question regarding the Army is Christian, who says that he is an officer in the Royal Engineering Corps. He was wondering if you had any contact with any engineering corps on the American side.
Well, yes, we weren't so formal in the early days as to have a proper engineering corps. Unlike other armies, not like the French and all that, usually the engineering corps would be a man who was told to dig a hole. However, we later established proper demarcations such as that, and the engineers, especially the sappers, were very useful to us. At Yorktown, we would not have prevailed without them. Now, for those who know not what a sapper is, it's a man who digs an open tunnel, you might say, in a straight line, and then zigs, aye, and then zags, so the enemy cannot shoot them. The purpose of it providing a trench, a long trench that leads the enemy, that leads our forces to the enemy, so that they might defeat them. So indeed, the French especially had wonderful engineers, wonderful sappers. And Lord, I tell you, those cannons, what they brought over, those 35-pounders, Lord, just as pretty as a spring day.
The next question I have is stepping a bit away from the war and still somewhat related. I think it will help move us into some of the events that have happened since the war. Courtney wants to know, how many uniforms like the one you're wearing do you own, or is this the only one you kept, and were they made in Virginia?
Well, yes. This one, in fact, was made by my wife, and you can see she did a fine job of it, considering it was made by her hand more than 17 years ago. Yes, indeed. I once had at least 7 uniforms, but time and nature and moths have disposed of all of them except this one. Yes, indeed. Now, the men, they would usually have but 1 or 2, and they always had to keep them in good order. But given the endless supply trouble we had, you unfortunately had men often with patches on their uniform, or shoes that were rotten, or no uniform at all, just civilian clothes. And you couldn't discipline the boys for that. It wasn't their fault, you know. We simply were never able to establish proper supply lines until, well, really, I suppose all the way until Yorktown. We had great difficulty with that.
Thank you. Now, Arden has a question about your future. They've noted that you're an eloquent speaker. Do you think this, with your associations from the war, do you think it will influence your future? Do you think you may go into politics? Do you have any interest in going into a federal level, or only staying at a state level?
Well, I've been offered federal service on several occasions. I've been encouraged by Mr. Jefferson to run for Congress. I've also been offered a seat on the Supreme Court, and President Washington, he offered me the position of Attorney General of the United States. I have seen fit to reject all of these, but I'm presently serving as a commissioner regarding the Jay Treaty, as we spoke of earlier. I desperately wish to serve this country, but I'm very much afraid of party spirit. It seems to prevail all things these days like a cancer. And men have stopped disagreeing with one another civilly, and instead have come to regard their fellow countrymen as enemies. Not opponents, mind you, but enemies, as aliens. And I am very fearful of contributing to that, for that is the path of ruin. On that road lies the ruination of any country which should succumb to such folly.
Well, and that leads me to the next question. I hope this isn't too sensitive, but I know in Virginia particularly, the battle over whether or not to ratify the Constitution. We know now that it has been ratified, but it was very uncertain. Did you support the federal Constitution, or were you more of an anti-federalist opinion?
Now, I supported it, as I still do now. I had the honor to be elected to the ratifying convention at Richmond, and there I stood with the great genius James Madison and other remarkable men, including His Excellency Governor Edmund Randolph, and we spoke for many days. They did most of the speaking, I should say. I didn't speak until the end, and I had to speak against the great Patrick Henry, Governor Henry, a man whom I've admired my whole life. Yet, in this particular circumstance, being opposed to the Constitution, he was in error. Even the greatest men can make a mistake from time to time. And fortunately, we were able to persuade the convention to our side, though only by 5 votes.
Thank you very much. Elizabeth has asked, where did you go to school?
William and Mary. Yes, indeed. This very place, the Athens of America, the most ancient institution of higher learning in all the New World. Now, the Massachusetts man will claim that Harvard is older still, but he makes that claim in error. Yes, they have a charter. They have a charter what is older than ours, but they had no buildings, you see. Now, if I were to take a piece of paper and stand in a dilapidated barn and call myself a professor, and call that barn a college, an institution of higher learning, would anyone take me serious for even a moment? Surely not, surely not. They would say that's foolishness, and they would be right. It is foolishness, as is the claim that Harvard is the oldest school. That is absolute and utter nonsense, and the Massachusetts men very well know that. William and Mary, I say. What were we talking about?
Your education.
Oh, yes, education. Yes, I was trained under the tutelage of many fine gentlemen, including the great George Wythe. I was trained in law. And I have been a lawyer, and I find it to be a most agreeable and useful profession. At William and Mary, I also did study Greek and Latin, divinity, and I dare say it was my serious examination of divinity what has today made me a very irreligious man. I fear I have no use for religion at all.
Well, you clearly love your alma mater, although I must say, I thought that there was a short time where William and Mary had a bit of a reputation for rambunctiousness outside of the classroom.
Much exaggerated, much exaggerated. Of course, so I expect you're referring to my fraternity of the FHC, yes?
Yes.
Indeed. Well, we had ourselves many wonderful confabulations at the Raleigh Tavern over a fine bowl of Madeira. Beautiful ritual. I would take a bowl of Madeira, a nice big bowl of punch, of rum punch, and I should drink the bowl first, and then I'd pass it over to Jamie, and then he would pass it on over to Douglas, and so on. It would go into a great circle until we had fathomed or drained the bowl. And then we would speak upon wonderful things. I don't really remember what we spoke about, but I'm sure they were exceedingly lofty and useful to mankind.
Wonderful, thank you. Well, we're getting close to the end of our time, so if there are any other questions, I recommend folks sending them in. But as we get close to the end, is there anything else that you have done since the end of the war that you would like to highlight for people?
Well, yes, as I spoke earlier, I'm most proud of my work at the state ratifying convention. Now, it may be difficult, especially for you younger lads, to understand this, but the Constitution was extremely unpopular some years ago. In fact, it's quite a miracle that it passed at all. I dare say if it were had been put to a popular vote, it would not have passed. But without that document, in the years before, we were in chaos. Shays' Rebellion up in Massachusetts was only the most extreme example of the mob violence that was occurring up and down this continent in those days. There was simply no means to govern ourselves, to conduct intercourse between the states. You had near war break out between New York and Connecticut, my own Virginia, and the people of Maryland. Maryland put gunships on the Potomac River to keep us from fishing. We were in chaos, and we were on the swift road to division, and then, divided up, fractured, we would be defenseless before the empires of the world and become the plaything of Europe. The Constitution saved us from that fate, or at least it has thus far. And I am most pleased in the modest role I played to accomplish it.
Wonderful. Ian was wondering if you had ever met General Washington's physician, Dr. Craik.
Yes, I did meet him once. I don't really, it's not a very pleasant thing to recall. You see, I was suffering from a distemper of the abdomen, and he gave me a purgative, which inspired, many great motions of nature, which did keep me exceedingly uncomfortable for many days and ruined a wonderful pair of breeches.
Thank you very much. All right, I think we're at our very last question. It's been wonderful speaking to you, but I think this last one is a good one. It's a bigger one. It has now been 15 years, if you can hardly believe it, since the Treaty of Paris was signed ending the war. But given what you've seen since, Are you happy? Are you nervous? Are you pleased with the way that the country has turned out?
Well, yes, by God, yes, I'm pleased with it. All right, well, yeah, we are not perfect. What nation under the sun is, eh? But nay, I could not be more pleased. We have accomplished, how to explain? Well, I'll put it to you thusly. 2 years ago, up in Philadelphia, I witnessed a miracle. President George Washington freely and peaceably relinquished power to our current president, Mr. John Adams. No cities were pillaged. No men had to die. How long has it been since the human race has seen such beneficence? 2,000 years? I cannot think of a great leader, of a great nation, given up power so easily since the days of Cincinnatus 2,000 years ago. Liberty is a precious thing, a rare thing that has existed very briefly in the history of man. It's been snuffed out so many times before. In Macedon, in Athens, in Rome, where the great Cato was brought low by Caesar and the glory of the old republic destroyed. And men ask me all the time why I do not suppose that we should not suffer a similar fate. Well, I'll tell you why. We are not those people of antiquity. We are not a bunch of puffed up, over-civilized Greeks, nor are we a pack of bloody-minded Romans. We are Americans. We are the people that the world threw away. And when our ancestors got on those ships, whether they wanted to climb aboard or not, they brought with them a fire born of desperation, a mad and tenacious hope that they could escape from the bonds of history and build something new, something better. And so they worked until their hands bled. They laughed, they loved, they sang, and they survived. And now we stand upon their shoulders, the shoulders of all those millions what gave everything so that we might be free. It is a great responsibility. And I know in my heart that we shall not fail them. I know that what we witnessed on that day 2 years ago is no anomaly, but shall be repeated again and again and again, happily, throughout the ages.
Thank you so much for meeting with us today.
Oh, my pleasure. Indeed, and I wish to thank all you good students, and you faculty. You boys, now be good, but not too good, and if they ain't, you professors, give them a good knocking about the head, and that will put them right. And now I must myself adjourn to the Raleigh Tavern, where I'm going to be meeting with old James Monroe, and he and I are going to drink an ocean of liquor and eat a mountain of calves' brains together. And so, my friends, until we meet again, may God keep you well, and may God save the United States of America. Thank you for watching this afternoon. This live stream is made possible by your generosity. We appreciate your support for the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation. Have a great day.